All right, everybody, hello. Welcome to this evening's presentation with Dr. Linda Bloomberg, one of our very own School of Education faculty members. So my name's Emily Sprenger. I'm an academic trainer in the Center for Teaching and Learning, and we are so excited to be able to have Dr. Bloomberg come back. This is the fourth part of our four-part qualitative research series. So today, Dr. Bloomberg will be diving into reviewing the role of the qualitative researcher, power and positionality. Couple of very brief housekeeping things before I turn this over to Dr. Bloomberg. Please remember you are more than welcome to have conversation in the chat. I know, as always, Dr. Bloomberg wants to be able to answer your questions. So if you do have questions, please pop that in the Q&A function of your Zoom. And then, as always, we are recording our webinar and we will post it in our C2L resource center for viewing pleasure for later, so you can come back and review some things. And then the last piece I'd like to tell you in terms of housekeeping is, if you would like to see a scrolling subtitle of this webinar, you can hover over the bottom of your Zoom, select the CC option and hit show subtitle if you would like to see that as this webinar progresses. So I think those are my housekeeping pieces for today, Dr. Bloomberg, and I will kick it right on over to you.
Thanks so much, Emily, to you and the CTL as always for hosting these webinars, which are for the purpose of helping our research and dissertation students understand some of the components of research. Today's webinar focuses on the role of the qualitative researcher with a particular emphasis on power and positionality, which we're going to be going into in quite a lot of detail here today. As always, I would love this presentation to be interactive, meaning I'm not the only expert here by any means. Everybody has a perspective to share, and I really look forward to people sharing their perspective throughout. I'm going to be stopping at various points along the way for questions and discussion, and then we will have some extra time at the end for questions and discussion again. So please remember your questions for when I stop. I'd love to address these, and any and all questions are welcome as well. So that said, I'd like to just go into, for a moment, the learning objectives and the webinar outcomes, because these are the reasons that I developed this particular webinar. So this presentation focuses on clarifying the issues pertaining to researcher power and positionality. And specifically, my hope is that each person on the call here today will learn more about the idea of a qualitative researcher as instrument. That's actually an acronym or a saying that we use in the field of qualitative research, and we'll be discussing a little bit more about that as we move forward. Some of our participants on this call today, I know, have already conducted their research and have already gotten their dissertations completed and defended. And I'm sure that those alumni who have moved forward do understand that in qualitative research, the researcher is the primary instrument, and we'll be talking more about it, as I said. We're also going to look at the role of the qualitative researcher with an emphasis on power and positionality and the ways in which power and positionality significantly impact the entire research process throughout, from beginning to end. We're also going to look at ways to ensure that hierarchical structures inherent in the research process, which are, as I say, inherent and are there anyway, so we cannot deny them, but understand how they can serve not to diminish or undermine trustworthiness and ethical standards. So we're going to be looking at ways to mitigate the problems that can arise due to power and positionality issues. And we're also going to be examining the criticality of ongoing researcher reflexivity, which really is a critical component of qualitative research throughout the research process. So hopefully, the attendees today will walk away with a stronger qualitative mindset and also a strengthened awareness of the roles and responsibilities of the qualitative researcher, which actually are quite complex, as you will see, based on power and positionality. So let's look for a moment first as the concept of the researcher as instrument. And to do that, let's examine the essence of qualitative research. So for those of you who have already conducted your studies or who are in the process of conducting a qualitative study, you know that qualitative research involves the collection, analysis, and interpretation of narrative and visual data to gain insight into a particular phenomenon of interest. Description, understanding, interpretation, and communication are the main goals, and the researcher is the primary instrument for data collection and data analysis. The strongest influence on the entire research process, including participant reactivity, which means the way that our research participants interact and react to us as researchers, as well as the study's final outcomes, starts and ends with the researcher. And this is really because the researcher is the instrument. Researcher as instrument is key in all qualitative research. And these ideas have significant implications throughout every stage of the research process, because subjectivity and positionality of the researcher profoundly shapes all aspects of the research, as we'll see. So that really is, in a nutshell, what qualitative research is essentially about and what qualitative research strives to achieve. It really strives to understand a phenomenon through the eyes of the research participants. But because the researcher is the instrument, the eyes of the researcher play a huge role as well. So how do we develop a stronger qualitative mindset? Let's understand a few different key points. Firstly, the researcher is part of the social world, not outside of it. So we cannot ever think that the researcher is an objective bystander, as one may conceptualize a researcher in quantitative research, for example. The researcher is part of the social world of the research participants. Most often we are studying the other, which is the participants. And remember, we never do research on people, we do research with people. And that's one of the big differences also between qualitative and quantitative research, is that qualitative research really understands that we learn with and from our research participants. We are not separated from them as researchers. That said, qualitative research is not value-free and does not strive to be value-free. In other words, a researcher cannot say that they are not subjective. A researcher cannot say that they're objective, because as human beings, we are implicitly subjective and carry our own biases and assumptions with us right into the research process and throughout the process. Qualitative research has changed how researchers think about and act on issues, including objectivity, interpretation, and representation. And we'll see that a lot as we move forward. There is a huge difference between a qualitative and a quantitative research mindset. And this is also, I just want to make clear, this is not to diminish either one. My goal is not to diminish quantitative research at all, rather just to show the differences between qualitative and quantitative. So let's look at how the whole idea of transparency flows into the idea of trustworthiness. So because neutrality is not considered a part of qualitative research, because there is no such thing as neutrality. We cannot put aside our biases, our subjectivities, because we are human. We cannot be robot-like, because we carry these ideas with us on a daily basis. So because we do not strive to be neutral, subjectivity is inherent in all aspects of qualitative research, and the researcher does not strive for objectivity. Sometimes I see students saying that they will remain objective, and that is really not a goal of qualitative research, nor is it possible in the field of qualitative research. Rather, qualitative researchers seek conscious and intentional tracking of their own subjectivities that are at play in the research process, and they must account for these to the extent possible. This is really important in qualitative research in order to develop what is called a credible study. The goal is to make subjectivities, which are assumptions, biases, stereotypes, and prejudices, as transparent and open as possible. Now, before we get to ideas of power and positionality, I'm going to stop there for a moment just to take any questions or discuss any points that may have come up.
At this time, there haven't been any questions that have popped up from that, but I have no doubt there will be some.
Okay, if anyone wants to take the moment now to ask anything, we can stop for a moment. Otherwise, we'll carry on and stop again a little later. Has anyone got a burning question, thought, or idea that they'd like to share? Yes, no?
Not at the moment.
Okay, good. No problem. Okay, let's move on then to dig deeper into the ideas of power and positionality. Now, these concepts refer to the researcher's role, social location, and identity with regard complex relationships within the context of the research. And I say complex and really do mean complex because human beings are complex beings. We all carry with us ideas, assumptions, perspectives, biases, prejudices. Even though we try not to be prejudiced, sometimes we are. And these will just need to be transparently identified if they are going to be prevented from affecting or negatively impacting the research process, including the site and the research participants. Researcher positionality can impact all aspects and stages of the research process because the researcher is essentially in a position of power in conducting the research. Remember, as a researcher, you can make decisions about the research, you can make decisions about the participants, you can analyze the data in your own way, as long as it's an actual credible way of doing it, but you can go about analyzing in different ways, which is acceptable in qualitative research. And you could present the findings in terms of your own views and perspectives. So that gives you, the researcher, an immense amount of power. Systematic assessment of researcher identity, assumptions, biases, power, and positionality must therefore occur so that our research can remain credible, believable, and transparent, and hence trustworthy. So addressing power and positionality is central to credible and trustworthy research. Positionality is also multidimensional, and I want to just expand on this idea a little here. The dimensions of culture, class, gender, age, and political or social identity extend into the values and worldview that one brings to the research as a researcher. Remember, we cannot be objective human beings. We are carrying around our own values. We come from a certain position in life. We bring with us our own political and social identity. So all of these, in a complex way, impact and can negatively impact the research process if not adequately and transparently addressed. Therefore, researchers must pay close attention to the complex relational aspects of the research process. And this includes how interpersonal dynamics and the broader issues of power, privilege, and identity impact all aspects of the research process. This includes developing research questions, selecting and recruiting research participants, selecting a research site, selecting data collection methods, etc. And ultimately, it also impacts the data, the findings, and the ways that we interpret and develop conclusions and recommendations. So just on this one slide, you can see how multidimensional positionality actually is and how complex an idea this really is. Emily, any questions?
Yes, Dr. Bloomberg, and this came in, I'll wait to see if folks have questions about positionality and the multidimensional piece. But as those pop up, when you had mentioned any other questions right before in our first little break, Rob did have a question.
Okay, please go ahead. I'm just quickly grabbing my dog, but I'm not.
Oh my gosh, not a problem. Rob did have a question. The question is preferences for defining outline reflexivity in chapter 3. Oh, looks like he also expanded in the Q&A as well too. So Rob's question is, can you discuss ways to efficiently present, discuss reflexivity where qualitative work, for example, case study, draws on factual information as opposed to a research narrative?
Firstly, I'm not really keen on talking about factual information in terms of qualitative research, because remember, qualitative research is about understanding a particular phenomenon from the perspective of the research participants. So what counts as a fact to one person is not necessarily a fact to somebody else, because there is no particular one truth. So in qualitative research, I would really shy away from the whole idea of factual information and rather stay with perceptual information.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then Rob, let us know if there's anything else that kind of percolates from that. Oh, yep, there's a little tidbit added onto it. I guess a demographic fact, for example,
Well, I'm so sorry, my dog
You're
is.
totally fine.
Demographics are the demographics of the participants. I'm imagining this is what the question is about. Participant demographics are things such as age, gender, the kind of demographics that would define a person. I still don't feel comfortable calling those facts.
Okay.
But we do definitely have demographic information. If all of us have demographics, and we can choose to portray or describe the demographics of our research participants to the extent that we wish without ever identifying who those participants are. So often in tables where we would list the participant demographics, we would not have participants' names, for instance.
Okay, wonderful. And Dr. Bloomberg, one more question about positionality. Sure. So is there a need to understand or articulate implicit or explicit positionality of a researcher? For example, I have found in my research results the need for explicit communication because of stigma associated with implicit understanding.
That's a little bit of a difficult question to answer, but what I'm going to say is explicitly, that means fully explaining our positionality by way of a positionality statement, where you have an opportunity to state your positions, your biases, your perspectives as a researcher, and what you bring to the table as a researcher is really important. And I've written a whole chapter on this in the new 5th edition of my book, because researcher positionality is a huge area that does need to be addressed in qualitative research, just simply because the researcher brings so much to the table that can impact the research. So transparency and being very explicit about all aspects of positionality is really essential. So by way of a positionality statement, a researcher has the opportunity to lay that all out for the reader and for the committee.
All right, Dr. Bloomberg, thank you so much for diving into that question for us. And that is it for now.
Perfect. We're going to have lots more time to answer questions.
Okay.
So positionality is one thing, and it cuts across the entire research process. The other idea and the other concept is power, which is inherent as well in the research process. Because the broader social and cultural context that we find ourselves in daily life is duplicated within the research context. This ties back to what I said earlier about the researcher being in a position of power. Therefore, playing the role of the researcher will reproduce the inherent hierarchical power structures that privilege some people, silence some people, and deny some people their own existence. All of this comes into play in the research process. So to be attentive to issues of diversity and inclusion, it's important to highlight the ways in which research participants who identify as minorities or underrepresented or marginalized groups feel themselves as they engage with the researcher. And again, this requires an enormous amount of empathy and understanding and transparency, so that you as the researcher are really in tune with your research participants, who they are, what they bring to the table, what their experiences are, and really be very mindful of portraying the research participants and their experiences as authentically and realistically as possible, without letting our own biases, assumptions, and positionality negatively affect the outcome of the research. We achieve all of this through the whole idea of reflexivity. Because, again, I'm going to say this again, a qualitative researcher does not strive to be objective. The researcher must acknowledge inherent subjectivity. And a central aspect of qualitative research is the researcher's reflexivity. Reflexivity means that researchers must acknowledge and disclose themselves in the research, aim to understand their own influence on the process, rather than trying to eliminate the effect that they may have on the research process. Reflexivity requires explicit, which means stated, not just implicit, but explicit self-consciousness and self-assessment by the researcher about their own views and how these views may influence design, execution, and interpretation of the research data and the findings. awareness of the role of the researcher occurs not just at the beginning, but throughout the entire research process. And reflexivity is this idea of reflection and ongoing reflection on who we are, what we bring to the research process, how it can impact the process, the participants, the site, etc. Ongoing critical reflection occurs throughout. And so to ensure credibility, critical reflexivity is important at all stages of the research process. This includes data collection, data analysis, interpretation, and the representation of the research participants' experiences, their own experiences. That is what representation refers to. And we're going to look at all of these 4 stages now in a little bit greater detail. So just before we do again, I'm going to stop for a moment in case any questions have popped up before we go into detail about each of these 4 stages of the process.
And I'm just going to wait just for just a couple of seconds. It usually ends up being where we pause and then there isn't one, and then we move on, and then there's 3 or 4.
I always just like to give people opportunity to speak out as the thought pops into their head instead of holding on to it.
Absolutely.
And maybe forgetting it later on down the line.
Yes, absolutely. I think for now, Dr. Bloomberg, if we dive into this next piece, there will be more.
Let's go into data
wait,
collection.
Hold on. So sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Bloomberg.
No, not at all.
What about this? Could you explain a little bit more? Just someone's feeling a tad bit confused about the thought of reflection happening all throughout the research. What does that mean?
That really means thinking throughout the research process, thinking about how you as the researcher can potentially impact the research process, including the participants and the site. And one of the best ways to engage in reflexivity is not just to sit and think about it, but to actually write about it, to journal. So a reflective journal is a key element of really good qualitative research. And most researchers who have engaged in a really good and high quality study have used a reflection journal. A reflection journal is really a great opportunity for a researcher to think about all the different thoughts that come into one's mind and really think about these critically on an ongoing basis and to journal them, to write them down. This gives you the opportunity to go back later on and look at what your thoughts were, how they may have changed, why you think what you think, and really give you a chance to really delve deeper and truly reflect on your role as a researcher. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you so much.
So let's take a look at data collection. Qualitative data analysis, sorry, this is the wrong word. Qualitative data, I needed to take out this word analysis, but I'll do it later. Qualitative data is collected by way of methods that are determined by the researcher. So remember, as you're setting up your study, and those of you who have already conducted your qualitative study know that you will choose either interviews or a focus group, or surveys, or observation, or critical incidents, or a combination of these. Remember, you always have to have at least 2 data collection methods in qualitative research for purposes of triangulation, but it's up to you as a researcher to make those selections yourself. So these are determined by you as the researcher. And you also decide what type of data to collect, whether it's demographic data, perceptual data, experiential data, or a combination of all 3, which is usually the case in a rigorous qualitative study. Data analysis is the process that seeks to make sense and meaning of the data that you've collected. You now have an opportunity to really dig into what you've collected by way of your interview transcripts or your observation sheets, etc., and to really try and understand what the data mean by way of qualitative data analysis, which includes coding and thematic analysis. Again, the researcher has the opportunity to decide how and in what ways to analyze the data. Remember, there are different ways of doing it. You can use a manual approach. You can use you can use software, one of the software programs such as in vivo. But again, it's up to the researcher to decide what process to use. And herein comes that idea of power again, that you have a power to decide. Data interpretation takes data analysis a step further by really delving into how you understand the participants and their experiences. You've analyzed your data, you've gone through coding, you've developed your themes, but then the question is, what do these really mean? What does the data really mean? And again, it's up to the researcher to make that determination. What the data means is really what you think it means as the researcher. And here again is that idea of power, that you have the opportunity to really put forth what you think the data means. Nobody's going to say, well, it doesn't mean that, because you do have the power as a qualitative researcher to really think about what it means and to state that. And this is very different to quantitative research, where you don't really have the chance to say, well, what does the data mean? Because the numbers speak for themselves. But with people's experiences in terms of narrative and visual data, you do have that power to make the determination of what the data really means. And then representation is the final stage, which is hugely important, because here you would have to think very critically about writing your findings and the ways in which you as the researcher are going to go about representing the site and the research participants. So the kind of questions to ask yourself are, for whom do I speak? What voice am I using? And to what end am I actually conducting my research? These are really important questions. And these are the kind of questions that you would ask yourself and think about in a reflexive manner and write about in your reflective journal. Why am I doing this research? What is really my point in conducting this research? Whose voice am I representing? Am I speaking for my participants, or am I speaking as the researcher? And remember, those are two very different things, because as the researcher, your responsibility is to most authentically represent the participants' experiences, not your own. So as the researcher, you will also need to consider all of these issues, no matter what or whom you're writing about, because it's an ethical responsibility to examine our roles as researchers and the challenges that our own implicit and explicit biases and assumptions bring to the table. Here again is a little bit more on reflective journaling. As I said earlier in the question that I answered a few moments ago, journaling is an ongoing opportunity to develop a research habit that will deepen your thinking around critical and key issues and processes throughout the research process itself. Journaling benefits the development of a chronology of your thoughts, questions, assumptions, and ideas. As I said earlier, as you journal and as you think more deeply and as you write and as you develop your journal, it may get quite long, depending on how often you're doing it and how thoroughly you're doing it. And it's really wonderful to go back to earlier stages as you proceed through your research and see what you thought at earlier stages of the process. Have your thoughts changed? And if so, why? These are really important questions to ask yourself. Reflection allows you to make deeper connections between ideas and shed light on your own developing perspectives, viewpoints, and questions as a researcher. It also provides information that can be drawn upon for analysis and interpretation. This is a really valuable tool, the reflective journal, because when it comes time to analyze your data, you will necessarily go back and look at your journal, which will really help you in terms of presenting your analysis and interpretation. And as always, don't be afraid of asking yourself why and why not. Oops. Why and why not at all stages of the research process. As you're thinking, as you're writing in your journal, ask yourself, why am I thinking this? Why am I not thinking that? And that will really, really drill down to the deeper critical thinking of the issues. Okay, I'm going to stop there a moment. Again, Emily, if there are any questions before I go on to the whole idea of credibility.
Yes, hold on one second. I want to see if Cheryl is allowed to talk. Oh, forgive me, Cheryl. Hold on one second. Cheryl, are you able to unmute?
Yep, I'm unmuted. Unmute.
Perfect. You're great.
So my question is, thank you for this presentation. It's very enlightening. At first, I wasn't going to attend, but I said, you know what, I better. And with that said,
Happy to have you. Yeah, Cheryl.
My study is based on the question of how can Black women, women of color, execute a large business venture successfully do this. That's what my research is based on. And you said that in order to be explicit and as unbiased as possible, that I should not be a part of the study. I'm also, at the same time, this is kind of like hard for me not to do, because at the same time, I am actually in the midst of a large business venture. So my question, I guess, is how do I do that, to continue my business venture and the research and remain as unbiased as possible?
Well, that's a fantastic question, but as I said earlier, we cannot separate ourselves from the research, because usually we do research on a topic that is something of a passion and something that we're involved in, either personally or professionally. So the fact that you're involved in a business venture should make no difference at all to your research. What will help is that you are as transparent and reflexive as possible, so that in your dissertation, you state your biases and perspectives up front. You don't have to deny them, because every researcher is entitled to their own thoughts and their own perspectives. The important point is to make them transparent. Okay. So you're in a great position. You don't have to step away from your business. You don't have to shut that off. You don't have to try and be objective. All you really should be doing is trying to be as transparent and explicit as possible by acknowledging what you as a business venture owner or a business person brings to the topic that you're studying. But the fact that you're studying something that in an area that you work in is absolutely acceptable. And that's the best type of research to do, because you're bringing your own experiences. So your experiences can really be valuable as long as they're made explicit.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl, for that question.
Thanks, Cheryl. That was a great question that I think really applies to most people. Because remember, we do want to conduct research on an area that's important to us, that is meaningful to us in terms of our personal or professional development. And so we usually land on something in an area that we work in or we have experience in. So that's absolutely essential, and nothing to try and shut off at all.
Thank you so much for that. There's a few more questions, if it's okay, if we
Sure,
move over that. Okay, great. The transparency the researcher shares is typically written about in a positionality statement, correct?
Yes, and in different programs and different templates, that can appear in chapter 3. It can also appear in chapters 4 and 5. I would suggest that the placement of a positionality statement is something that you discuss with your dissertation chair, so that you have it in the correct place. Sometimes it can be stated in more than one place, because it comes into your analysis and interpretation as well as chapter 3, where you're really laying out your positionality. But I'm very excited, as I said, to really be presenting an in-depth chapter on power and positionality, and also on research ethics, actually, which plays into power and positionality in this new edition of our book that's about to come out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Bloomberg, for that. A couple more things. Something just happened up here in the chat. Francis asked, I would like to find out the difference between researcher reflexivity statement and positionality statement.
Well, a researcher, the concept is a positionality statement. A researcher reflexivity is the way that you reflect on your role as a researcher, and that helps you develop a positionality statement. So it really is a positionality statement that you're developing through reflexivity, put it that way.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And then Francis, let us know if you have further questions about that.
Course.
Yes, and then another piece here too. Alan's asking, which sections of the dissertation should the researcher mention the different levels / stages of the reflexivity?
Again, this really depends on the template that you're using and the program that you're in, and something to just discuss with your dissertation chair about: where should I insert this? Where should I include it? Where does it make most sense? And I'm sure that you will land on the best way of presenting it. There can be a whole section on a positionality statement. There can be a declaration of researcher assumptions early on in the dissertation, and then you come back to that, you circle back to that later on in the findings and interpretation section. Sometimes, and very often, you may have changed your assumptions. Having done the research, you may have a different viewpoint, or maybe not. But again, it's really wonderful at the end of a qualitative dissertation. I usually offer my students an opportunity to have a final researcher statement at the very end of the final chapter. And this has been a wonderful addition to some of my excellent students' works, which most students really do produce really wonderful studies. Each one is completely different. But having that opportunity to include a researcher statement or researcher final reflection statement at the end is your opportunity as a researcher to really go back to some of those initial assumptions and reflect on them. And here is where your researcher journal comes into play. You can go back to your journal, see what you thought earlier on. It could be a year previous, it could be months ago. But really go back and say, wow, I thought that, but now I think this, or I thought that, but my research has now shown me this. And that's really a great part of qualitative research, which comes full circle, that you really show that you have thought so critically and deeply, and coming to the close of a study, this is what you now think or believe, or this is your perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. There's about 5 questions in the Q&A at this time. Would you like to go through a little bit more?
Yeah, let's go through them. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a great question, I think, from Zoanne. So for someone who's not used to journaling, is there a suggested template available for a reflexive journal, or is it like, what are your recommendations for that?
There isn't as such a reflective journal, but it's really just about making yourself a list of critical questions, like, why do I think this? What brings about these thoughts? Where did I learn this? How did I learn it? Why do I think this way? Why do I think I don't think this way? Brainstorm for yourself a lot of questions and use those as your key prompts to help you think more deeply about a particular issue or topic or subject or idea that has popped up. So I think developing yourself a list of critical questions and really pushing yourself to really think more deeply about some of these that may not even be that easy to think about. They may be hard realities to face, but that's really the way that you get to the bottom of your own positionality and power, and really try and flesh out where this comes from, why you think this, how it can be helpful or unhelpful in the research process. Remember, it's not just unhelpful. It's not just that we're bringing thoughts and assumptions that are going to impact badly. Our thoughts and assumptions can also bring great value. So it's just a general all-round deeper critical thinking process about the whys and the hows and the ifs and the what ifs of situations.
Thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. Let me see here.
And just by the way, sorry, Emily, are you taping this so that it will be
yes.
Good, great. So that we will have all of this for everybody who wants to reflect back on these ideas and listen to them again later on. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes. Another question. Can you discuss a little bit more about the researcher as an insider or an outsider, and how these concepts relate to power and positionality?
I'm just going to give a kind of very broad overview on that. Okay. For example, if one is doing research on a community that you're part of, say you're in a school and you're doing research with your colleagues, you might be considered an insider. If you're doing research with, say, students in the same school, then you might be considered an outsider because you're really not part of that student group. So researchers can be insiders or outsiders, and that can also shift because you might be doing research with a group of colleagues and you think that you're in that group. But when you're examining their experiences, you realize that maybe their experiences are not the same as yours, in which case you're partially an outsider. So you do bring that inside-outside sort of balance with you as a researcher. We're always, as humans, insiders and outsiders, and it can change, it can switch, depending on who we're with, what perspectives we share, what perspectives we have in common or not in common. That really is what makes us insiders and outsiders. And again, that's a great point to journal about in your reflective journal. Like, am I an insider here? Am I an outsider? Why? Why am I an insider? Why could I perhaps be an outsider? And if I am an outsider, what am I bringing to the table? And also, if I'm an insider, what am I bringing to the table? So there are all these different questions on all these different levels. So going back to Zoanne's question, there's so many different questions we can ask ourselves to really make our reflective journal a very, very valuable resource for our research toolbox.
Yes, and this next question, does kind of touch on the whole insider-outsider piece, but Wendy's asking, how does the researcher handle the situation where some of the participants are familiar to him or her? So, for example, go ahead.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
For example, have attended professional development together, have been coaches in, have been programs and coaches together, or are in a common partnership?
This is a very sort of tricky, sort of slippery slope, because if we're conducting research with people that we know or work with, the IRB would want to know that, because there could be issues of undue influence. Whereas if, for example, if we supervise people and we're doing research with them, those particular people may feel that they have to participate in the research, that they have to please you with certain answers, or they have to answer a certain way because that's what they think you're expecting from them. So it's typically best not to do research with people that you know or have worked with, and definitely not anyone that you are coaching or that you have a supervisory role with. That really, you'd have a very hard time getting IRB approval if you're going to do research with people that you work with or supervise. And really, it's because then the power dynamics are extreme. And we're really trying to minimize power as much as possible. We're trying to be explicit with our positionality, and how can we really be impartial or unbiased, and how can our participants really engage in research in an unbiased and transparent and free manner if we are their boss or we are their supervisor. So that's a really important point to take into consideration, and I would really say stay away from that as you're creating your research sample.
And then this is the last one in the Q&A for right now, but I think it also kind of ties into what we've just been talking about. But just for clarification, and I want to make sure we address Rosa's question. Rosa asks, I'm on a school board and would like to do research regarding play-based learning in the kindergarten classrooms. Would this be a conflict of power or position situation? Should I go to a different school district? And it kind of touches on what you just were talking about.
It really is best to do research with people that you do not directly work with or supervise. And you could, it'll just place you in a much more transparent position where people don't know you and they don't have to feel that they have to answer according to what they think you want of them, or they may feel that sometimes, you know, there's the feeling of I could lose my job if I don't participate in their research, or I could lose my job if I don't answer a question that they're asking me and I think they want this kind of answer and not that kind of answer. And you really don't want to put your research participants in that sort of predicament of feeling anxious and uneasy in a research situation. You want people, and you really do need people to voluntarily participate in research, not to feel that they need to participate for any particular reason. So also to avoid a big bottleneck with your IRB approval, I would say rather do research in a different school.
Thank you so much for your suggestions, Dr. Bloomberg. That's it for now.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much, Emily, for fielding the questions and for really putting them out there in a very easy way for all of us to deal with them. So let's move on then to the idea of credibility. And credibility is the researcher's ability to take into account all the complexities that present themselves in the study and ensure that the study is indeed trustworthy. Now, remember, for qualitative research, there are 4 different criteria for trustworthiness: credibility, dependability, confirmability, and transferability. But the big one here that's related to researcher power and positionality is credibility. So let's for a moment reflect on the study's credibility. And I know that we only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to go a little faster here so that we have time at the end. And again, Zoanne, here are some really great questions, Zoanne and others, that you can actually use as your reflective journaling. And when you get this presentation, when Emily posts it probably tomorrow, you can go back and actually grab these questions and use them in your journal. Because these are the questions that you can ask yourself regarding what strategies you can implement to increase the credibility of your research. In what ways does my positionality impact aspects of my research design, including selection of site and research participants and choices regarding data collection and data analysis? Since qualitative analysis employs purposeful sampling, what should I consider when selecting the research site and the research sample? Who are being excluded or included, and why? That's a really important question to ask yourself, because remember, you're creating the sample yourself through purposeful sampling, whether it's convenient sampling, which is the least desirable, right through criterion-based sampling, but you're creating the sampling strategy nonetheless. And you're deciding who to include and exclude. It's not random sampling as in quantitative research. It's very purposeful, and it's your own purposeful sampling. What assumptions underlie your data collection methods or instruments? And what assumptions underlie your data analysis approach? So those are all questions that you can reflect on in terms of your study's potential credibility. Analysis and interpretation is an act of power because you are interpreting someone else's reality and telling their story. This is a huge aspect of qualitative research. And very often this is one of the critiques of qualitative research from quantitative researchers, where they say that you're interpreting someone else's reality and telling their own story. Like, how can you do that? This is really where the researcher has to be very explicit about their own biases and assumptions to actually mitigate the dangers involved in telling somebody else's story. We must really understand this as a complex issue to be addressed with transparency and integrity. Addressing this ethical responsibility requires a reflexive approach that includes developing and maintaining a commitment to openness, to critical feedback and change. So basically, along with your researcher reflexive journal, you also need as a researcher to be very open to critical feedback and change from your committee members, from other readers of your research, and really listen to what the concerns may be and be open to making changes. So this is really also a step in the right direction to not rigidly adhere to what you believe is right or wrong, but really listen to different perspectives to try and gain clarity around the best way to analyze and interpret your findings. Reflecting on analysis and interpretation, again, there are many questions to ask yourself. And again, these can be part of your reflexive journal. Have I examined the ways in which my own biases and assumptions may affect analysis and interpretation of the data? What do the data reveal, and to what extent am I allowing the data to speak for themselves? This is a very important concept in qualitative research. In other words, how am I shaping and informing the study by way of my own assumptions and biases? Or am I allowing the data to really speak for themselves and try and be as transparent as possible about my assumptions and biases, not try and ignore them and not try and set them aside because that's not really possible, but acknowledge them and explain how your assumptions and biases could be shaping your data analysis and interpretation. What steps am I taking to remain open to new possibilities and alternative explanations? And if I'm not taking any steps, why am I not? In my analysis and interpretation, have I fully respected participants and attempted to the best of my ability to do justice to their experiences? And if you feel that you haven't, ask yourself, why not? And can any harm befall the site and or the research participants as a result of my analysis and interpretation? And think very carefully about that, because at the end of the day, when you present your study or you publish your study, you want to make sure that no harm can come to your research participants, either by way of disclosing their identity or their location, or misinterpreting their experiences. You want a research participant to actually, in fact, be able to pick up your study and really feel that you've represented their experiences authentically in the best way possible. Let's get to the representation of participants' experiences. So here again is the issue of the other in research, which has a long history and legacy, and questions around voice, language, and participant portrayal are a source of ongoing discussion in qualitative research. There are many aspects to consider when formally writing up qualitative research in order to authentically represent the research participants, their context, their diversity, and aspects of their experiences that you're studying. The goal ultimately is to produce an authentic, respectful, and ethical representation of individuals, groups, and communities, all those different levels. Because remember, what we write about individuals will necessarily affect groups of people and even more broadly, communities. And how do we reflect on representation? Again, there are many questions to ask yourself. What is my research agenda? Whose voices are privileged in the study and whose voices may be silenced? In other words, who am I choosing to portray? Whose voice am I showing? Whose voice am I keeping covered? And why? Why are you doing that? Has my representation of the research site and the research participants accurately, ethically, and with integrity portrayed the experience of those who participated in my research? In writing up my findings, have I fully respected participants without any judgment and attempted to do justice to their experiences? And if my research participants were reading my study, how would they feel? This is what I mentioned a few minutes ago. Would my findings and the way that I've represented the site and the participants themselves resonate with the participants? And this is something to really ask yourself and to really consider, because very often our research participants do not see the end result. They do not read your dissertation. Very often they don't even get access to it. But you as a researcher really do have responsibility to ask yourself that question, that if my research participants were reading the study, how would they feel? Would they feel that I had done them justice? Or would they feel that I had done an injustice to their experiences? And this is a very important question to think about more critically. Okay, I'm going to stop over there for a moment.
Sorry, I was muted there. Apologies. Yes. One quick question here in the chat. What is the best name to refer to them, the research participants or subjects?
We don't refer to subjects in qualitative research because that sort of objectifies people. Okay. Let's rather refer to them as research participants. And we do give our research participants pseudonyms. And my preference is to really give people actual real names like Emily or Linda or Jane or John, rather than numbers. Because very often we even ask our participants, I'm gonna let you choose a pseudonym for yourself. Who would you like to be? We're not going to talk about or include your real name. What would you like your name to be in this study? And that really gives participants some sort of power in making choices and having a voice in how their experiences are portrayed. They may choose a name that is of significance to them. They may choose the name of a family member or a friend or someone that they respect or someone that they aspire to be. And that is why I really recommend not using numbers or letters, because that is not what people are. That really makes people subjects and objects rather than human individuals.
I love that suggestion. Thank you so much for that. I'm glad you brought up that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Appreciate
all
that.
The questions are excellent. I love questions because they really bring out all of our inner thoughts, and we can all learn from all of these questions. So thank you very much for the questions.
Absolutely. I just want to make sure we have enough time because there's about...
we're basically at the end, and I was just going to take questions now and just talk about the four. This is the final of the 4 presentations, but I do want to take the questions at this point.
Okay, fantastic. Okay, couple of things here. So Alan asked, should the researcher give a broad statement of the research purpose, and does the researcher share the biases with their participants?
I guess that we would share the biases with participants if that situation arose. If a participant questioned something or said, well, what do you feel about this? Then we should be very upfront. But we generally don't go to the participants and say, well, these are my biases or these are my perspectives. As a researcher, you don't really need to do that. But if you're asked about it, then you must be ready to respond.
Thank you so much. And then another one from Talana, excuse me. So when we do member checking, how do we reflect on the participants' opinion about the accuracy of the portrayal of their voice?
That's a great question. And member checking is one of the strategies to make sure that we are accurately representing our participants. Now, usually member checking occurs at the transcript stage. We would do our interviews, audio record and transcribe verbatim, which means word for word, not making anything up, not leaving anything out. And we would then send that transcript back to the research participant and ask them just to read through it and see if they feel that it's correct. If they feel that there are any inaccuracies, then they have the right to point that out, and then you would need to address that. If they feel, well, I didn't really say this, I didn't really mean this, I don't want you to write this in, then you would have to take that out and respect their choice. We typically don't show our analysis to the research participants, because that would mean going back to them some months or even a year later and saying, well, this is how I analyzed your experience. But if any research participants or the site where we've conducted the research want a copy of the dissertation, then we are obliged to let them have a copy. and actually read the study for themselves. Hopefully at the end of that, we're not going to have a participant that says, well, I never said this and you've made this up, or it's inaccurate, or I don't agree with this. And I've never heard of that happening. But in the event that it does, we would have to address that and really maybe make some changes if a participant felt very strongly that their experience was not accurately portrayed. Because remember, participants are voluntarily participating. So they do have a right to withdraw at any time or to make a statement about the accuracy or validity or realisticness of your findings.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Bloomberg. Right now, I don't have any other questions in the Q&A. Several people have mentioned, thank you so much for this valuable information and amazing information to support their work, so they appreciate it. Anything else that, oh, thank you. I'm so glad you brought that up. Any news on the release of?
Yes, this book is actually about to be released.
Okay.
And Sage Publishing will offer a 30% discount with this discount code SAGE30 for anyone who wants to purchase the book. But remember, the book is also available, well, the 4th edition, this one over here, the white cover is available in the NCU library. The other book will hopefully be available as soon as it's out. But the discount code is for purchases, should anyone want to purchase them directly through Sage. The book is also available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. But as I say, the 5th edition, I'm very excited about this new chapter on research ethics and rigor, which includes a whole section on researcher power and positionality. And I really feel that it was important to include it in this edition because it really plays such a central role in the research process. So, and I'm also always very happy to discuss this topic. So aside from the book and the chapters in the book, I'm always available for discussion on these important issues. And so always feel free to reach out with your questions through the Commons or in a discussion in the Commons. If you want to tag me, I can respond over there. So this is an ongoing discussion where we can all bring our shared insights to the table. And there is no one person who's an expert on this topic. We can all learn from each other. So I really appreciate the opportunity to share our perspectives and insights here today through the CTL, and with Emily moderating as excellently as she always does. And I think we always, and I know that I always walk away from these presentations just feeling invigorated, because there are so many shared ideas and thoughts way beyond the actual PowerPoint presentation that we all can walk away with now and give some thought to. The questions were really excellent and thought-provoking, and I really appreciate those of you who proposed these questions. So I was very happy to present on this, and I really hope that it's been valuable to the participants as you move forward with your research. And I really wish everybody the best of luck and much success with your research, your qualitative research. And for those of you who've already conducted your study, I appreciate that you've attended this call, this webinar, and I hope that you're going to take your research in different directions through publications and or presentations.
Absolutely. And Dr. Bloomberg, I just want to echo all of our attendees. When you ask these questions, we can all learn something from that process as well. So I really do appreciate it. I certainly am looking forward to the journaling process. I'm currently working on my doctorate degree, so I am going to take that recommendation and use it.
Yeah,
so,
and please, all of you, use the questions that I have outlined in this presentation, but also develop your own questions. Challenge yourself. Ask yourself the hardest questions possible that you may not want to even answer for yourself. Put yourself in the spotlight and ask yourself, like, why am I thinking this? Where did this come from? And how can this benefit or be dangerous in my research?
Absolutely. And Dr. Bloomberg, I will say, just because some of our attendees asked if they will be getting a copy of this presentation. Yes, I'm going to send a copy to anyone who registered. We also do have a public YouTube channel, and you can subscribe and never miss a webinar. And then, of course, we are going to post it internally as well, too, in our CTL webinars resource section. And I think without any further comments or questions, keep in mind that Dr. Bloomberg is 100% serious. If you want to carry on this conversation and have more questions, please post them in the comments and tag Dr. Bloomberg. I will be sure to follow those comments as well too, because every day we are learning something new. And Dr. Bloomberg, your 4-part series for qualitative research has been so invaluable, and I'm just super thankful and grateful that you brought it to the CTL.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. You and I started planning this series of 4 many, many months ago. Like at the beginning of the year, I think we started planned for June, July, August, and 2 in August. And so we've come to the end of this set of 4, but the conversation continues. And there's a lot to think about, but because they've all been recorded and will be posted in the CTL and on YouTube, thanks to Emily and her team, we can refer to any of these: alignment, trustworthiness, ethics, and power and positionality at any point as we're going through the research process. So I hope that these 4 will be a valuable addition to everybody's resources as they move forward with their research.
Well, as always, thank you, Dr. Bloomberg. And thank you to all of our attendees. And until the next time we see you, I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and good luck on your research.
Yes, thanks everybody. I appreciate everybody's time and participation. Thanks, Emily. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.